Some scandals explode and disappear. Others leave something behind. The Epstein case did neither. It didn't close. It didn't fade. It fractured public trust. Because this was never just about one man. It was about access, influence, protection, and the uncomfortable question of how power actually works. To understand the Epstein case, I think we have to start somewhere most people don't. Not with the charges. Not with the arrest. But with a simpler question. How did he get there? Jeffrey Epstein did not come from a powerful political dynasty. He was not a globally recognized financial titan. He was not the public face of a major corporation. And yet, at some point he had access to politicians, billionaires, royalty, scientists, and cultural elites. That, to me, is where the real mystery begins. Epstein started out as a teacher at the Dalton School in New York, a prestigious institution. What makes that detail interesting is that he did not complete a formal university degree. Still, he managed to position himself inside an elite environment. From there, he transitioned into finance. And this is where things become less clear. Officially, he worked in the financial sector. He managed wealth. He advised extremely wealthy individuals. But if you try to trace a straightforward, transparent path explaining how he built his fortune, the details become vague. We're not talking about a CEO of a publicly traded company. We're not talking about a well-known hedge fund with a visible performance record. We're talking about private relationships, discreet consulting, and an extraordinary lifestyle. Multiple luxury properties, private jets, global connections. And this is where I personally think many people begin to feel something doesn't quite add up. How do you gain that level of influence without a proportional public footprint? In high-level finance, massive success usually leaves traces. Deals, firms, public partnerships, clear institutional roles. In Epstein's case, the explanations often remain ambiguous. That ambiguity does not automatically imply guilt. But opacity creates suspicion. Another striking element is the range of people he associated with. His connections crossed political lines. Different industries. Different ideologies. That raises another uncomfortable question. What exactly was he offering? Access? Influence? Connections between worlds that rarely intersect? Because he did not appear to be just a financial advisor. He seemed more like a social connector. Someone who moved within powerful circles and linked powerful individuals to one another. And this is where the story begins to feel larger than a single man. In my view, his rise is the key to understanding everything that follows. Because if you treat this as just a criminal scandal, you miss the structural question. But if you start asking how power networks function, how closed circles form, how access becomes currency, then the case becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story not just about a person, but about the system that allowed someone like him to exist at that level. And maybe the most uncomfortable question is this. Was Epstein a product of the system? Or did he simply understand how to navigate it better than anyone else? If Epstein's rise raises questions, the year 2008 changes the entire tone of the story. Because for the first time the legal system steps directly into the picture. In Florida, following an investigation, Epstein faced serious accusations involving the exploitation of underage girls. Early investigative reports suggested a much broader case, potentially involving multiple charges at the state level. But what happened next became one of the most controversial legal moments in the entire Epstein timeline. Instead of a full trial with extensive charges, the case ended with an unusual legal agreement. A deal that would later be known as the 2008 Non-Prosecution Agreement. Under this arrangement, Epstein pleaded guilty to lesser state charges, avoiding far more serious federal prosecution. And this is where things become legally complicated. because the agreement reportedly provided federal immunity not only to Epstein, but also to potential unnamed co-conspirators. From a legal perspective, this was highly unusual. In cases of this magnitude, plea negotiations are typically scrutinized closely, and victims are usually informed as part of the process. In this situation, that did not happen. Years later, it was revealed that many victims were not properly notified before the agreement was finalized. This detail would later become central to the criticism surrounding the case. The sentence itself also raised significant questions. Epstein received an 18-month sentence. In practice, he served roughly 13 months. But even that time was not typical incarceration. He was granted what was called work release, allowing him to leave the detention facility for extended periods during the day for professional activities. For many observers, the situation appeared difficult to reconcile. In a legal system where similar crimes often lead to severe prison sentences, this outcome seemed unusually lenient. And naturally, the public began asking a simple question: how was such a deal possible? The official explanation pointed to legal strategy, evidentiary challenges, and the decision to secure a guaranteed conviction rather than risk a complicated federal trial. But critics argued that the agreement was extraordinarily favorable. Years later, the handling of the case was reviewed again. A federal judge eventually ruled that the victims' rights had been violated because they were not informed about the agreement beforehand. That ruling was significant, because it shifted the conversation away from speculation and into the realm of legal procedure. This was no longer just a moral debate. It became a question of transparency, procedure, and equal application of the law. For many people, this moment created the first real fracture in public trust. Not because it proved some grand hidden scheme, but because the legal outcome appeared deeply disproportionate to the severity of the accusations. And the justice system depends on one core principle: equality before the law. The 2008 deal did not close the Epstein story. In many ways, it delayed it. And perhaps more importantly, it planted a seed of doubt that would resurface more than a decade later. Because when justice appears negotiable, questions don't disappear. They accumulate. For nearly a decade after the controversial 2008 agreement, the Epstein case seemed almost forgotten. For the public, the story had largely disappeared from the media spotlight. But for many of the victims, the story had never truly ended. Over the years that followed, investigative journalism and new testimonies slowly began bringing the case back into public view. One of the most significant developments came from major investigative reports that examined the 2008 plea deal and the circumstances under which it had been negotiated. Those reports raised serious questions about how justice had been handled. And for the first time in many years, public pressure began to grow again. Then, in 2019, everything changed suddenly. Federal prosecutors in New York reopened the case. This time, the investigation moved to the federal level. In July 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, shortly after his private jet landed. The arrest was not just another legal development. It was a global media explosion. This time, the federal charges were extremely serious and centered around allegations that Epstein had operated a long-running system involving the exploitation of underage girls. According to the prosecution, the alleged activities had taken place over multiple years and involved properties in both Florida and New York. The accusations described a structured pattern, in which victims were reportedly recruited and brought to Epstein's residences under various pretexts. These allegations dramatically changed the scale of the case. It was no longer simply a story about a controversial plea deal from the past. It was now an active federal prosecution. And for the first time, there appeared to be a real possibility that a full trial could reveal details that had never been publicly examined. The moment Epstein was arrested, global attention intensified. Media outlets around the world began following every development closely. Because Epstein was not an ordinary defendant. He was known for his connections to extremely powerful individuals, politicians, business leaders, public figures from multiple industries. And this is where speculation began to grow. If the case went to trial, what might emerge? What testimonies might be presented in court? What names might appear in the legal record? Federal prosecutors stated that they had gathered significant evidence and witness testimony. At the same time, Epstein's legal team strongly denied the allegations and attempted to secure his release on bail. But the court refused. The judge ruled that Epstein would remain in detention while awaiting trial. The primary concern cited by the court was the risk of flight. And the reasoning was not difficult to understand. Epstein possessed enormous financial resources, properties in multiple countries, and access to private aircraft. All of these factors suggested that he could potentially leave U.S. jurisdiction if released. As a result, Epstein was transferred to a federal detention facility in Manhattan. There he would wait for the legal process to continue. For the public, this moment felt like the beginning of a new phase. Perhaps even the moment when the entire story might finally be examined in open court. After years of controversy, unanswered questions, and legal disputes, it appeared that the case was moving forward again. And perhaps for the first time, the full scope of the situation might become visible. But what happened only weeks later would once again change everything. And it would transform the Epstein case into one of the most debated and controversial episodes in modern legal history. After his arrest in July 2019, the Epstein case appeared to be entering a decisive phase. For the first time in more than a decade, there was the real possibility of a full federal trial. A trial where testimony, documents, and the broader context of Epstein's activities might be examined in open court. For many observers, this moment seemed like the beginning of long-awaited answers. After years of controversy, legal disputes, and unanswered questions, it appeared that the justice system might finally bring clarity to one of the most disturbing cases in recent history. But the events that followed would once again change the direction of the story. Jeffrey Epstein was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal detention facility where he was expected to remain while awaiting trial. Shortly after his incarceration, the first warning signs appeared. In July 2019, Epstein was found in his cell with injuries to his neck. Officials launched an internal investigation, and he was temporarily placed under what is known in the U.S. prison system as suicide watch. This status involves strict monitoring procedures designed to prevent self-harm. At some point, however, that status was lifted. Epstein was moved back into a standard cell, where he was initially housed with another inmate. Days later, circumstances changed again. On the night of August 9th into the early hours of August 10, 2019, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out, leaving him alone. The following morning, correctional officers found Epstein unresponsive in his cell. Jeffrey Epstein was pronounced dead. The official ruling later determined the cause of death to be suicide by hanging. That remains the official conclusion of the medical examiner. Yet almost immediately after the announcement, questions began to emerge. Not only in the media or online discussions, but within institutional reviews as well. Because several elements surrounding that night raised concerns about procedure and security. First, the correctional officers responsible for conducting regular inmate checks did not fully follow the required schedule. Later investigations revealed that some of those checks were not carried out according to protocol. Second, certain surveillance cameras in the relevant area of the facility were reportedly not functioning properly at the time. For a detention facility housing one of the most high-profile defendants in the country, These details quickly drew attention. There was also the broader context. Epstein was arguably one of the most closely watched inmates in the federal system at that moment. The case against him was not only serious but globally followed. He was facing federal charges that could have led to a major trial involving testimony from numerous witnesses. All of these factors contributed to a powerful public reaction. Because Epstein's death effectively halted the criminal trial. There would be no courtroom proceedings, no cross-examinations, no full presentation of evidence before a jury. And that sudden ending is what fueled public speculation. Public trust had already been shaken by the earlier legal controversy surrounding the 2008 plea agreement. The existence of powerful connections in Epstein's social circle only added to the sense that the full story might never be completely told. It is important, however, to separate documented facts from speculation. The official ruling remains suicide. At the same time, internal investigations identified serious procedural failures within the detention facility. 2 correctional officers were later charged with falsifying records related to the required security checks during that night. These details do not change the official conclusion, but they help explain why the case continues to generate debate. Because sometimes it is not only the outcome of an event that raises doubts. It is the circumstances surrounding it. Jeffrey Epstein's death did not close the story. In many ways, it made the story even more complicated. Because when a case of this magnitude ends abruptly, the questions rarely disappear. They remain, and people continue asking them. The Epstein case did not provide all the answers. In many ways, it left behind more questions than conclusions. Because when a story ends this abruptly, when a trial never takes place, when a system appears to falter at critical moments, doubt naturally follows. Jeffrey Epstein is gone. But the questions surrounding his world, his connections, and the system that surrounded him never truly disappeared.